Ukrainian armed forces have started to use underwater drones to attack Russian shipping, according to Russian sources, while the US are reporting that the Russians started to execute soldiers that refuse orders or retreat under Ukrainian artillery fire. There's also a report that a fresh unit was stepped up by the Russians that is built out of former Ukrainian prisoners of war that volunteered to fight against Ukraine. We'll look into this topic as well in this situation report. Hello and welcome. We'll start with the overall situation of some messages about the background. Here, there was a fresh attack with Shahid drones and Iskander-M. While Shahids are basically used daily against Ukraine, one thing is kind of standing out, that the Russians started to increasingly use Iskander-Ms in the last few weeks. Far bigger use than we've seen in the past. At least it makes that impression. The Ukrainians are also saying that more than 500 Shahid have been used in September alone, showing us the volume of attacks now being done with those drones. And back to the Iskander, it's unclear the reason for that. One reason might be that they managed to increase the production quite significantly, while the Ukrainian forces have a limited capability of intercepting ballistic missiles, basically only one version of their S-300. And the Patriot missile systems are capable of doing that, and Ukraine only has very limited amount of either. The Ukrainians are also saying that the switch to composite components on the Shahid drones in their construction makes it more difficult for them to spot them, likely with radar. So the interception of them is getting more difficult. The Brits are saying that the lack of attacks with heavy bombers is an indication that the Russians might be running out of KH-101 cruise missiles. One other reason might be, though, what we mentioned here in the past, that Russia seems to be intending to build up a certain stockpile of cruise missiles to overwhelm the Ukrainian air defense when they start their winter campaign trying to take out critical infrastructure inside of Ukraine. On the eastern front here, we have Russian attacks along the whole front line. Russians are claiming that they gained some ground in the direction of Kupiansk and in the direction of Torske, which is here. I have no visual evidence of that whatsoever. I do not have a confirmation from the Ukrainian side either, so no idea if that's true. Ukrainian counterattacks were defeated and didn't achieve any results either. South of the Seversky Donetsk, a number of Ukrainian attacks failed. I do not see any success achieved by them whatsoever, whereas the Russians increasingly keep attacking and seem to be show the clear intention of taking over the initiative. We have attacks reported both north and south of Bakhmut by the Russian side. We also have one confirmed success here at the Berkhivka reservoir. Now we have Ukrainian sources, for instance, admitting that they lost parts of the southern area, or I mean, it was so-called gray area or contested area before, but now the Russians seem to hold permanent presence in this area here as well. The attacks generally seem to intensify. Like a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, I was reporting that the Ukrainian side was saying that fresh reinforcements are arriving for the Russians at Kurdyumivka. This seems to be the indication that it's showing its first results already. The Russians clearly seem to be poised on taking over the initiative. They are also reporting counterattacks on Klishivka and Avdiivka. Some claims from the Russian side are that they regained some positions on the other side of the railroad dam. I have no confirmation of this whatsoever at this moment, so it's unconfirmed. I cannot say that the Ukrainians were pushed back here at all, but we see increased Russian activity around Bakhmut as well. South, further at Avdiivka, on the other hand, we do not have any confirmed change in territory. The Russians might have advanced somewhat here along the railroad tracks. They tried to widen the control on their side of the railroad track. They might have achieved something here, but I do not see any confirmed change in territory. The reports are that significant Ukrainian reinforcements are arriving. Among that, for instance, the 47th Mechanized Brigade that was just recently fighting south of Orikhiv. It seems to have been laterally redeployed more or less directly from Orikhiv to this area to stem the tide here, and at least it seems to have been successful. Further south, we have additional attacks. Marinka, the fighting continues. A huge number of Russian attacks being reported in the last few days, but no change in territory. Novomikhailivka, the Russians are also trying to push in, but so far more or less unsuccessful in the last 24 hours. On the border of the oblast, we have some fresh fighting reported. Ukrainian attacks were reported. No success, no confirmation that anything changed. The Russians also attacked more or less between Novodonetsk and Priyutne. No change here either, so the front line seems to have been stable regardless. The interesting part is, for the first time in a fairly long time, I'm not sure if I had it before that there was no change whatsoever here, but that's also the message for today. I don't even have serious reports about significant attacks on this area, so the front line seems to be more or less stable by now. The rainfall seems to play a role here, that the Rasputitsa plays a bigger part in the fighting, but overall the Ukrainians don't seem to have attacked in any seriousness, and I don't read about strong Russian counterattacks into their offensive either. On the Dnipro, we have a visual evidence of the Ukrainians closing in on Oleshki. It is a geolocalized video of them being shelled with a TOS-1. That is somewhat interesting because TOS-1 is generally a strategic system, so it's not one that can be commanded by battalions or smaller units like companies or anything like this. This is a strategic asset that is being moved around, also due to the small amount that is available. That the Russians now deploy TOS-1 in this region shows how serious they start taking the Ukrainian advances towards the other side of the Dnieper River. The shelling here happened south of the Dachas, which would be an indication that the Ukrainians definitely control them in their entirety now, as they are in their process of pushing towards Oleshki, but that's it what I have from this here. I do not have fresh reports about change in territory, anything here. I do not see Russian claims anymore that Krynki does have a Ukrainian presence. They might still be in there, or they might have been pushed out. The only thing I found from Russians is that the fighting is near Krynkri. It's also near Kosachi Laheri. It's near Pitstepne. It's near Pishchanivka and Poima. Along the whole line here, the Ukrainians are having positions on the islands mostly, but also here on the mainland. They are pushing towards the town spot. I do not have any confirmation about fresh successes, and as said, it's possible that they have been pushed out of Krynkri, but I cannot confirm it as of now if the Russians have been successful with this. From the Crimean Peninsula, we have a claim by Russian military bloggers that the mine chaser Vladimir Kositsky was attacked by the Ukrainians. They confirmed that it was attacked and that an explosion happened, but they say the damage was so light that it already started doing its regular job operation again. They say the explosion was underwater, and they say it was very weak though, so they assume it was actually done with the Remus 100. That's this system here, what we see here. It looks like a torpedo, but it's a underwater drone, more or less. It has 100-meter depth capability, so it can dive up to 100 meters. It has 5 knots maximum speed, and when it goes with a cruising speed of 3 knots, it has 22 hours of range, which would translate to more than 100 kilometers. So I guess it would somehow be capable of striking something there. Whether and how the targeting is supposed to happen is a different story though, but I have no information about this. The Ukrainian side has received Remus drones, at least what I found in the past, so they seem to have those, and at least according to the Russians, this is the likely weapon, the likely system that the Ukrainians are using, but as it is not meant to strike ships, the explosives it can carry is fairly limited. The Ukrainians, the Americans are saying that the Here we have it here from a press statement of the White House. We have information that the Russian military has been actually executing soldiers who refuse to follow orders. We also have information that the Russian commanders are threatening to execute entire units if they seek to retreat from Ukrainian artillery fire. The Russian embassy in the US said that somebody has a lot of fantasy on the American side, so they categorically deny that this is true. I'm not capable of verifying it. There was a video circulating around roughly half a year ago that supposedly showed the killing of some fleeing Russian soldiers by their own men, but to me it looked staged. And all the other informations I found I was never able to verify them. It basically started from the beginning of the war, from the first days in the Battle of Kiev, the claim that Kadyrov's units were behind the front line executing deserters. I have not seen any evidence until now. So while it's possible, while it would be in Russian tradition, there is no proof that they actually did this right now, at least now, no proof that I have available. Partisan, or we should say intelligence agency activity, also happened on the Crimean Peninsula. In the town of Yalta, the Oleg Saryov was shot several times by assailant. Oleg Saryov was a Ukrainian politician in the national parliament. He ran 2014 at the presidential election, but was a pro-Russian politician. He then was the president of the parliament of Novorossiya when the so-called People's Republics of Luhansk and Donetsk united in a parliament. And when this parliament was ended, ceased to exist in 2015 because of the Minsk II, I think, accords, he left his post, and I have not seen him doing any significant political activity since then. Now, at the beginning of the full-scale war, he became a public voice to a certain degree again, for instance, demanding from the governor of Kryvyi Rih that he hands over the birth city of Zelensky to the Russians and things like this. So he stuck to his beliefs, if we want it this way, but I have no actual information what he has done recently that would warrant the Ukrainians to hunt him down and execute him, because that's the rumors right now, that the SBU, the Ukrainian intelligence agency, tried to kill him in this event. Supposedly he's heavily injured, but in hospital, and at least at the last moment, the last information I had, he was still alive. As said, I can't say much about this. He was shot down. Why the SBU would use an asset to strike him and not somebody with a more prominent role, I can't say, but that's what we have right now. And the last information I have is also that the Russians say they don't know who did it. They haven't caught anyone yet. When it comes to troop generation, we have an information here from Russia, RIA Novosti. They are saying the 1st Battalion of ex-Ukrainian Armed Forces fighters joined the Russian unit. So they are saying that 70 volunteers from prisoners of war that were taken have now decided to take up arms against the government in Kiev. They're currently being trained and being sent to the front line soon. There are claims, there is like the reference that if they have been pressured, it would be against the Geneva Convention and illegal and a war crime. Obviously, it would be, but as of now, I do not have any proof of this, that they have been forced. We should assume that thousands of Ukrainian soldiers were taken prisoners, several thousands, before the war. Dedicated pro-Russian parties received 10% of the vote. So 10% of Ukraine's population outside of the occupied area was pro-Russian. That you would assume a certain amount of those stays pro-Russian even after the invasion. Obviously, some moved away from that position under the impression of an actual war, a full-scale war breaking out, but that some still hold that sentiment is obvious and likely, and that among thousands of prisoners of war, the Russians are capable of finding a few that are willing to turn over to the other side. Seems kind of logical, has a lot of historic precedent, and the Ukrainians have a Russian volunteer unit as well that supposedly recruited hundreds of Russian prisoners of war into itself as well. In both cases, both with the Russian volunteer units that supposedly recruited Russian prisoners of war, as well as in this case, we do not really have proof that the numbers they are claiming are anywhere close to the truth. The Russians are saying roughly 70, and I haven't seen a video. We see a couple of faces here. What is that? 6 men? and those might even not be Ukrainians. So I think the informations here are somewhat dubious. It's obviously of high propaganda value for either side to present a volunteer unit from the other side, basically proving to the world and to the own audience that they are on the right side of history, that as even the enemy soldiers start to fight for us. So this is more a propaganda tool, and that they should find a couple of volunteers trying to fight for the Russians is kind of logical in the context. So I wouldn't consider it to be too important, and I wouldn't immediately cry war crime because, as said, there are tons of historic precedents. Even in World War II, I think the National Socialists, the Third Reich, found a couple of British and American citizens willing to take up arms to fight for the Third Reich. I think it was one digit each time, so it was really barely anyone, but they were able to present Americans and British fighting for themselves. We know that the Japanese recruited Indians, the SS and the Wehrmacht recruited all over Europe, including the occupied parts. So finding some volunteers shouldn't be too much of a surprise in this context. We also have another interesting thing when it comes to recruitment, troop generation. Kadyrov, the leader of Chechnya, has announced the creation of a new volunteer battalion. Its name is Baysangur Benoyevsky. The Baysangur Benoyevsky Volunteer Battalion. The interesting part about it is that Baysangur Benoyevsky was a Chechen who was a military leader of the last uprising of the Chechens against Imperial Russia. So basically, he's an anti-Russian Chechen national hero, and in that unit named after him, Chechens are supposedly being recruited to fight for Russia. That is an interesting context, and I would love to hear an explanation from Kadyrov why he chooses this name, what kind of interior politics within Chechnya might play a role there, but it's a really fascinating thing to take somebody who fought Russia, take his name for a unit that's supposedly fighting for him. Obviously, it could be to demonstrate how much Chechnya has been turned pro-Russian, or I don't know. The himself, Baysangur Benoyevsky, had been arrested, had been caught in 1861, and was then sentenced to death by the Russians and hanged. So he was killed by the Russians as well. A new law has been put into effect in Russia, from what I understood, and that law will force relatives of soldiers that are missing in action to hand over DNA samples to help identify the fallen if they can't be identified in this context anymore. And we do have some information here about more recruitment. There are stories that migrants have been arrested. Migrants that were naturalized in Russia, they have been arrested because they ignored their recruitment papers, that they have been called up for recruitment, probably for the conscription. And should they be charged, the maximum penalty is imprisonment for 2 years. The interesting part is Russia changed the system, that now you don't have to be handed the papers anymore, but it can be on a digital system. And at least what I found is that it's fairly possible that a lot of Russians don't even use the system where they are announced to join, where they are called up. So they might have been called up and never heard about it, now making them criminals, which will then obviously lead to the Russian government allowing to put pressure on them to maybe sign a contract with the military, which would allow them to be deployed in Ukraine, by in this way avoiding deportation and avoiding the stripping of citizenship. As I mentioned in the last situation report, the Russians are doing this now as well, that they strip citizenships of naturalized soldiers in this context. And we have some information about international support. The German government is sending new ammunition for the Mars 2, that's the M270. Basically ammunition that can be used by HIMARS as well. They're also sending a new IRIS-T SLM air defense system. They are sending a new air surveillance radar TRML-4D and 4 APCs of an unknown type. No idea what kind of APCs those are. And Denmark is sending fresh artillery. They are also announced that they're going to send T-72EA. That's from the company in the Czech Republic that is modernizing T-72. They're also selling BMP-2 and engineering vehicles, armored engineering and pioneering vehicles, armored recovery vehicles, like basically those supportive, armored supportive vehicles in this context are also being said. Part of it, at least, is also financed by the German government. That was it from me for now for this situation report about the war in Ukraine. If you liked this report, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps with the algorithm. Leave a comment what you think about the current developments along the front line. Will the Ukrainian counteroffensive gain steam again or not? And if you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. This channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. Thank you very much to everyone already supporting this channel, and that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.